Ethan Cole had lived a life that few could imagine. Once he had been part of one of the most secretive military units in the world, a man who had spent years moving through shadows, crossing borders most people only saw on maps. But that part of his life was over. Now he lived alone on a quiet piece of land at the edge of a small town, far away from the noise of the world. His days were calm and slow, and for the first time in a long time, that was exactly how he wanted it. He woke up early every morning, not because he had to, but because his body was used to it. Even after years of retirement, his mind still carried the rhythm of discipline. The sun was barely rising when he made coffee, poured it into a chipped mug, and sat on the porch. From there, he could see the mist rolling off the trees and hear the distant sound of a stream that ran through his property. Beside him, lying quietly, was his dog, a large Belgian Malinois named Ranger. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He had served alongside Ethan overseas. The two of them had been through more together than most people could endure in a lifetime. The dog still moved like a soldier, alert, graceful, ready for anything. But here, in this quiet town, Ranger was just a companion, chasing sticks and keeping Ethan company on long walks through the woods. Most people in town didn't know who Ethan really was. He didn't talk much about his past, and no one pushed him to. The locals respected his distance. They just called him the quiet guy on the hill. Sometimes the mailman would stop for a minute to chat, or an old neighbor would wave when driving by, but Ethan never stayed long in conversation. He wasn't unfriendly, just private. He spent his days fixing fences, cutting wood, and repairing old tools. He had built the small cabin himself, and everything in it had a purpose. It was simple, but it was his. On the walls were pictures, not of people, but of landscapes, mountains, deserts, and oceans he had crossed. Only one photo showed him in uniform, standing beside Ranger, both looking straight at the camera. He kept that one near his desk, where he sometimes sat at night, thinking about the people he had lost. Ranger was the only part of his past that came with him. The dog had been injured during their last mission together. Ethan had fought hard to bring him home. He promised himself he'd give Ranger a peaceful life, away from gunfire and danger. That's what this little patch of land was for, a safe place for both of them to breathe again. Every evening, Ethan would take Ranger down to the creek. The dog would splash around in the shallow water while Ethan watched, a small smile breaking through the quiet seriousness on his face. The world seemed far away there. Sometimes he'd throw a stick or whistle softly, and Ranger would come running back, shaking water all over him. These were the moments Ethan cherished, but peace, as he knew too well, never lasted forever. It started as just another morning. The air was cool, and the sun had barely touched the tops of the trees. Ethan was chopping wood out back while Ranger lay a few feet away, chewing on an old rope toy. A truck drove past on the nearby road, a rare sound in that area. Ranger's ears perked up. Ethan looked too, but he didn't think much of it. People got lost out there sometimes. Later that day, Ethan drove into town to buy feed and a few supplies. Ranger stayed behind, as he often did. When Ethan returned an hour later, everything looked the same at first glance. The gate closed, the porch still. But Ranger wasn't waiting by the door like he usually did. Ethan called out his name. No response. He walked around the property, checking the fence line. There was a small opening near the back where a storm had knocked down part of the old wire. Maybe Ranger had gone through there chasing a deer. It wasn't unusual. The dog always came back. Ethan fixed the fence, then waited on the porch. By sunset, Ranger still hadn't returned. He wasn't worried yet, just uneasy. Ranger was smart, trained, and loyal. If he was gone this long, something must have caught his attention. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and started walking through the woods, calling his name softly. The forest was quiet except for the rustling of leaves. He searched for nearly an hour before heading back, trusting Ranger would find his way home by morning. What Ethan didn't know was that a mile down the road, a neighbor had called the sheriff's office. Someone had seen a large dog near their property and thought it looked aggressive. Ranger, protective as he was, probably barked at the strangers, not realizing the danger. The next morning, Ethan woke up early again, but this time the porch felt empty. The coffee went cold as he waited, watching the path that led to the woods. He was about to start another search when he heard a knock on the door. 2 sheriff's deputies stood there, their patrol car idling by the gate. "Morning, sir." one of them said, keeping his voice polite. You own a big brown dog? Looks like a shepherd? Ethan's chest tightened. Yeah, he said. Belgian Malinois. His name's Ranger. Why? The deputy glanced at his partner, then back at Ethan. There was an incident yesterday evening. A dog matching that description was reported acting aggressive near the Miller place. Deputies responded. He paused for a second, looking uncomfortable. There was a shot fired. Ethan didn't move. He just stared at the man, his mind struggling to process the words. What are you saying? He asked quietly. The deputy cleared his throat. Sir, the animal was shot. It's at the county shelter right now. For a long moment, Ethan didn't say anything. He just stood there, the air heavy between them. Then he asked, Is he alive? I'm not sure, sir, the deputy said softly. You can check at the shelter. They'll have more information. Ethan nodded once slowly. Thank you. He closed the door without another word, walked back to the kitchen and leaned against the counter. The world around him seemed to shrink. His breathing slowed, his hands shaking just slightly. He wasn't angry, and not yet. He was numb. He grabbed his truck keys and drove to the county shelter, his face expressionless. Inside, a young woman at the desk recognized him from town. She hesitated when she saw his expression. Ethan didn't waste words. I'm here for my dog, he said. Ranger, she typed quickly, eyes flicking between him and the screen. Then she stopped. Sir, she said softly, I'm so sorry. He passed last night. For a moment, Ethan didn't react. He looked down, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Can I see him? He asked. She nodded and led him to a small back room. Ranger lay on a metal table covered with a clean white sheet. Ethan reached out with one trembling hand and lifted the edge of the cloth. There he was, still peaceful as if asleep. There was a small mark near his shoulder, the sign of a single bullet. Ethan brushed his fingers through the fur on his head. You did good, he whispered. The woman quietly stepped out, giving him space. Ethan stood there for a long time. Memories flooded back. Missions in the desert, long nights in foreign lands, Ranger always at his side. The dog had saved lives, followed orders, faced gunfire without hesitation. And now he was gone, killed by mistake in a quiet town that didn't know who they were dealing with. When Ethan left the shelter, he didn't go home right away. He drove aimlessly for a while, past open fields and old barns until the road curved back toward his property. The house looked different now, too quiet, too empty. He sat on the porch again, but the silence felt heavier. He could still hear the echo of Ranger's bark in his mind. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at the old photo of them together. The grief didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, mixing with something colder, something that had been buried for years. He wasn't the same man he used to be, but the skills, the instincts, they were still there, tucked away beneath the calm surface. He didn't want revenge. That wasn't his way. But he couldn't let it go either, not without knowing exactly what happened. The next morning, Ethan drove into town again, this time to the sheriff's office. The deputies looked surprised to see him. He spoke quietly but firmly, asking for the report, the footage, and the names of those involved. They tried to give vague answers, but he wasn't a man who took half-truths. His voice stayed calm, his eyes steady. Everyone in that room could feel something about him. A quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to be respected. They didn't know his past, but they sensed it. There was something in his presence that made people straighten their backs and choose their words carefully. By the time he walked out, he had enough information to start finding answers. Not because he wanted trouble, but because Ranger deserved the truth. That evening, as the sun went down, Ethan sat on the porch again. The wind moved through the trees and the world felt a little colder. He looked toward the woods where Ranger used to run, and for a moment, he thought he heard the faint sound of paws on leaves. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Peace had been all he ever wanted. But peace, he realized, always came at a cost, and this time it had taken the only friend he had left. Ethan didn't sleep much after the day he lost Ranger. The nights felt long and empty, filled with the kind of silence that pressed against the chest. He kept hearing the echoes of that single gunshot in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ranger's face, loyal, trusting, and brave to the end. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to keep busy. He fixed things around the house, stacked wood, and worked in the shed. But no matter what he did, the quiet reminded him of what was missing. He used to talk to Ranger without even realizing it. Little things like, "Let's go," or "What do you think, buddy?" Now there was no sound except the wind and the creak of the old porch. The sheriff's department had called to say they were looking into the incident. Ethan had nodded silently when he heard those words. He had heard that kind of language before, the kind that meant they wanted the problem to disappear quietly. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let things go without understanding them. He needed to know why his dog was gone. He drove to town again a few days later, wearing the same calm expression he always did. The woman at the front desk of the sheriff's office greeted him politely, but her eyes showed a trace of worry. There was something about Ethan, his quiet way of speaking, the way he stood so still, that made people pay attention even when he wasn't trying to. "I'm here to see the report," he said. The woman hesitated. "You'll have to speak with the sheriff about that, sir." "I will," Ethan replied simply. The sheriff came out a few minutes later, a large man with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "It was a terrible misunderstanding. My men thought the dog was a threat." Ethan looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. "Did they try to call animal control?" "They didn't have time," the sheriff said, adjusting his belt. The animal lunged at one of them. He acted in self-defense. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice stayed even. "Ranger doesn't lunge at people. He's trained to stop on command." The sheriff sighed. "I understand you're upset, but from what I've seen, it was a judgment call in a tense moment." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I'd like to see the footage." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "That might take some time. There's paperwork, procedures." Ethan cut him off, his tone still calm. "I can wait." Something about the way he said it made the room go quiet. The sheriff promised to call him when the file was ready, but Ethan could tell from his face that he didn't plan to hurry. He left the office without another word and walked to his truck. The people passing by on the street nodded at him, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused, cold and steady. It wasn't anger that drove him, it was purpose. He had spent years in situations where emotions got men killed. Now that same control was guiding him again. Back at home, Ethan sat at his desk. He pulled out an old notebook and started writing down everything he knew. The time he left the house where the hole in the fence had been, when he noticed Ranger was missing, and what the deputies had said. It was habit more than anything. He had done this kind of thing hundreds of times before, piecing together truth from fragments. That night he made a simple dinner and ate in silence. Outside the woods were calm, but in the distance he could hear faint laughter, someone having a barbecue at a nearby property. It reminded him of how normal life went on for everyone else, while his had come to a sudden stop. He walked to the edge of the yard and stood there for a while, looking out into the darkness. For a moment, he thought about all the missions he'd survived, how he'd made it through ambushes, explosions, and impossible odds, only to lose the one companion who had been by his side through it all, here at home where it was supposed to be safe. The next morning, Ethan went into town again. He visited the Miller property, the place where the deputies said the shooting happened. The Millers weren't home, but their neighbor was mowing the lawn across the road. Ethan walked over and waited until the man turned off the mower. "Morning," Ethan said quietly. "Morning," the man replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for information about what happened here the other night," Ethan said. "My dog was shot." The man's expression softened. "Ah, yeah. I heard about that. Terrible thing. Didn't seem right to me, to be honest. Did you see it happen?" The man nodded slowly. "I saw the deputies pull up. The dog was just standing near the fence, barking. Looked scared, not mean. Then one of the officers shouted something, and I heard a shot. It all happened fast. Did he attack anyone?" Ethan asked. "No," the man said firmly. "He wasn't even close enough to. Just barking." Ethan thanked him and gave a small nod before heading back to his truck. He didn't say much more, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp now, focused, like someone quietly putting puzzle pieces together. By the end of the day, Ethan had already gathered more truth than the sheriff had offered, and it didn't line up with the report. He spent the next few days quietly looking for more answers. He called the county shelter to ask about the bullet, and they told him it had been removed for review. He asked who authorized that, and no one could give him a clear answer. He wasn't surprised. He started keeping a folder on his kitchen table. Inside were notes, names, and times. A habit from his old life, though now it was just him and the paper. Each small detail built a clearer picture of what really happened. Despite the calmness in his actions, the loss still cut deep. At night, he'd sometimes find himself reaching for Ranger's leash before remembering there was no one to walk with. He'd see the old chew toy by the porch steps and stop for a moment, lost in thought. One afternoon, while he was sitting outside, a young boy from down the road rode his bike up the hill. He stopped at the gate, holding a small folded piece of paper. "My dad said I should give this to you," the boy said nervously. Ethan took the paper and nodded. "Thank you." When the boy left, Ethan unfolded it. Inside was a short note written in a careful hand. "I'm sorry about your dog. I saw what happened." The officer didn't even try to calm him down. He just fired. There was no name, just initials at the bottom. Ethan read it twice, then placed it gently in the folder. He didn't know who wrote it, but it confirmed what he already suspected. He wasn't looking for a fight. That wasn't his way. He just wanted honesty. But as the days passed, he could feel that honesty wasn't going to come easily. A week later, the sheriff called. "Mr. Cole," he said over the phone, "we've completed our internal review. The deputy acted within department policy." Ethan listened silently, then asked, "Can I have a copy of the report?" "It's classified for internal use," the sheriff replied quickly. There was a long pause. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "Then I'll find another way to get it." He hung up the phone before the sheriff could respond. That night, Ethan sat by the window, the sound of crickets filling the darkness outside. He wasn't sure what his next step was yet, but he knew he couldn't let the truth stay buried. Not just for Ranger, but for the quiet belief that things were supposed to be fair, that right and wrong still meant something. He thought back to his time in Delta Force, how every mission had rules, structure, and accountability. There was no room for carelessness. If a man made a mistake, he owned it. Out here, though, he was learning that civilian life didn't always follow the same code. Still, Ethan wasn't one to lose hope easily. He believed in action, quiet, precise, measured action. The following morning, he drove into the next county. He visited a small law office and asked to speak with a friend, an old contact who had once worked with military veterans. The man recognized him immediately and listened as Ethan explained what had happened. When Ethan finished, the man nodded slowly. "You know, I can't promise anything," he said, "but I can make a few calls. There's a journalist who covers law enforcement cases. She's honest. If she hears your story, she might dig into it." Ethan agreed. Not because he wanted to be in the spotlight, but because he wanted the truth in the light. By the end of the week, a local reporter reached out. She came to his cabin, small recorder in hand, and sat across from him on the porch. Ethan told her everything in his quiet, steady voice. No anger, no exaggeration, just facts. When she left, she promised to look into it. Ethan didn't expect much. But a few days later, her article appeared online. The headline was simple: "Retired veteran service dog killed in mistaken police shooting." The story spread quickly. People started asking questions. The sheriff's office released a short statement defending their actions, but by then the public had already taken an interest. Neighbors came by to offer condolences. Strangers left flowers by his gate. Ethan appreciated their kindness, though he didn't say much. He wasn't looking for attention, just truth. At night, he sat by the porch again, watching the stars. He thought of Ranger, the missions, the loyalty, the years they had shared. He could almost feel the dog's presence beside him, calm and watchful. The fight ahead wasn't one of violence. It was a battle for honesty, and Ethan knew how to fight those, patiently, carefully, and with quiet resolve. Peace, he had learned, wasn't something you found. It was something you built, even after the world tried to take it away. Days turned into weeks after the article about Ranger was published. The story spread further than Ethan ever expected. People from across the state began to write letters and emails, offering sympathy and asking how they could help. A few even sent photos of their own dogs with little notes that said things like, "For Ranger, he'll never be forgotten." Ethan appreciated every message, but he didn't respond to most of them. He wasn't looking for attention. He didn't want fame, pity, or money. All he wanted was the truth. The peace he had built after leaving the military had been shattered. and he wasn't sure if he could ever get it back. Most days he kept busy, cleaning tools, fixing fences, or cutting wood. It helped keep his mind quiet, but at night when the world went still, the weight of it all came back. The loneliness pressed hard on him. There were moments when he'd catch himself turning his head, expecting to see Ranger lying by the door. Those were the hardest moments. The sheriff's office wasn't pleased with the attention the story brought. The department released a new statement saying the incident had been a tragic but unavoidable event. They insisted the deputy followed protocol. But people weren't convinced. The local paper printed letters from residents demanding transparency. Ethan didn't respond publicly. He stayed quiet, watching everything unfold from his porch. But behind that calm silence, he was gathering information, slowly and carefully. He didn't want revenge. He wanted accountability. That was something he understood deeply. You face your mistakes and you make them right. One afternoon, while he was working on the porch, a black SUV pulled up near his gate. A man stepped out, well-dressed, polite, but with a sharpness in his eyes. He introduced himself as Daniel Price, an investigator from an independent oversight agency. "Mr. Cole," the man said, "we've been reviewing the case involving your dog. Mind if I come in and talk?" Ethan nodded, leading him to the porch. They sat at the small wooden table where Ethan used to drink his morning coffee with Ranger sitting at his feet. Daniel opened a notebook. "I won't take much of your time. We're conducting a review because of public pressure. I wanted to hear your version of events directly." Ethan spoke simply and truthfully. He told Daniel everything from the day Ranger disappeared to the moment he saw him at the shelter. He didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize anything, just told it as it was. Daniel took notes quietly, occasionally nodding. When Ethan finished, there was a long silence. Daniel looked thoughtful. "You said your dog was trained," he asked. "Was he aggressive at all toward strangers?" Ethan shook his head. "No, he only reacted to commands. Even in combat, he didn't attack without signal." Daniel closed his notebook slowly. "That's what I figured. The footage I've seen doesn't match the report." Ethan's eyes lifted slightly. "You've seen the footage?" "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to be released yet, but I've reviewed it. From what I saw, your dog didn't attack anyone. He was barking but standing still. The deputy fired after about 5 seconds." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then why does the report say he lunged?" Daniel sighed. "Because if it says otherwise, they'd have to admit fault. And departments rarely do that willingly." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "So what happens now?" "I'll file my report," Daniel said. "But whether anything changes, that depends on how far people are willing to push." They talked a little longer before Daniel left. Ethan thanked him quietly, then watched the SUV disappear down the road. He stood there for a long time, thinking about what he'd just heard. It wasn't anger he felt. It was a deep, heavy disappointment. That night, Ethan sat by the small fire in his yard, staring into the flames. The woods around him were dark and peaceful. He thought about the kind of man he had always tried to be. Disciplined, fair, calm under pressure. He had lived his whole life by a code, even after leaving the service. And now he was watching people twist the truth to protect themselves. The next morning, he decided to visit the sheriff one last time. When he arrived, the office was quiet. The sheriff looked up when Ethan walked in. He seemed uneasy, like he'd been expecting this visit. "Mr. Cole," he said with a forced smile. "What brings you in today?" Ethan stood calmly. "I came to ask you something simple. Did you watch the footage?" The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "I did." "Then you know what really happened," Ethan said. The sheriff sighed. "It's complicated." "Hi, Deputy." "It's not complicated," Ethan interrupted gently. "You and I both know what that dog meant. He wasn't dangerous. He didn't deserve to die." The sheriff looked away for a moment, then back at him. "You have to understand I can't undo it. But I'll speak to the deputy again. Maybe we can find a way to make this right." Ethan nodded slightly. "That's all I wanted, honesty." He left the office without anger, without drama. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes justice wasn't about punishment. It was about truth being spoken aloud. In the days that followed, something began to shift in town. People who barely knew Ethan started leaving small notes at his gate. Messages of respect, words of support. One evening, a woman came by with her daughter. She said her husband had served in the military too, and that their family wanted to thank him for standing up calmly and respectfully. Ethan appreciated that. He didn't want attention, but it meant something to know people understood. The reporter who first wrote about Ranger called again. She told him that state officials had opened a formal investigation into the sheriff's department's handling of the incident. It wouldn't bring Ranger back, but it meant that the truth was spreading. Ethan spent the following days repairing the small wooden fence at the front of his property. He worked quietly, pausing sometimes to look toward the woods where Ranger used to run. He could almost picture the dog sprinting through the trees, tail high, alive and full of purpose. Sometimes at dusk, he'd sit on the porch and talk softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the memory of the dog that had stood by him through everything. He'd tell him about the people writing letters, about the investigation, about the world that finally seemed to notice. He didn't need a response. Just the act of speaking helped ease the weight in his chest. As weeks went by, Ethan started to notice a sense of peace returning. Not the same peace he had before, but a quieter kind shaped by loss and truth. One morning, he woke to find a letter in his mailbox. It was from Daniel, the investigator. Inside was a short note, case review completed, official recommendation, disciplinary action and retraining for involved officers. While the outcome can't replace what was lost, it acknowledges the truth. Thought you'd want to know. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it inside Ranger's old collar, which he kept on his desk. It wasn't justice in the way people usually meant it, but it was something, a recognition that what happened was wrong, that Ranger's life mattered. Later that evening, the local news ran a short segment about it. The reporter spoke about policy reform and new accountability measures. Ethan didn't watch the whole thing. He turned the TV off halfway through and went outside. The sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in soft gold. He stood there quietly, feeling the cool breeze on his face. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like something earned. He built a small wooden marker near the creek where Ranger used to play. It wasn't fancy, just a simple board with carved letters. Ranger, loyal beyond measure. He placed a small American flag beside it and stood there for a while, hands in his pockets. He thought about how strange life was, how a single moment could change everything. He'd faced battles overseas, yet the hardest one had come here, in the place he thought he'd finally found peace. But through it all, he never lost what made him who he was. He stayed calm. He stayed decent. He fought with patience, not anger. And maybe that was what made him truly strong. As the last light faded, Ethan turned back toward the cabin. He stopped halfway and looked at the porch where Ranger used to lie, ears perked, eyes watchful. He smiled faintly. "Rest easy, partner," he said softly. "We're good now." He walked inside and closed the door. The house was quiet, but not empty anymore. The memories filled the space, warm, steady, alive in their own way. That night, as he sat by the window, a gentle rain began to fall. It tapped softly against the glass, and for the first time since that terrible day, Ethan felt something close to peace. He leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy, and whispered, "Good boy." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a quiet breath, the sound of healing, slow and steady, one day at a time. The weeks that followed brought a slow and quiet change to Ethan's life. For the first time in months, he felt the air around him grow lighter. The tension that once filled his chest began to ease little by little. The investigation had ended, the truth had been acknowledged, and though it didn't erase the pain, it brought a kind of peace that Ethan hadn't felt since Ranger was gone. The small town started to see Ethan differently. People who once only waved from a distance began stopping by to talk. The man at the feed store offered to help him repair his old truck. The mail carrier, who used to just drop off letters, now paused for short chats about the weather or the garden. The world that once seemed quiet and far away was slowly opening up to him again. Ethan didn't mind it. In fact, he found that the company helped. It reminded him that even after losing so much, life had ways of offering small kindnesses. Sometimes that was all a man needed to keep going. He still spent most mornings on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise. The view never changed much. The rolling hills, the tall trees, the mist that lifted as the day warmed. But it comforted him. The routine gave him a reason to start each day. Every now and then he'd look toward the small wooden marker he had built by the creek. He had planted a few wildflowers around it, and they were starting to bloom. The bright colors stood out against the green grass. As he loaded supplies into his truck, he saw a few kids playing with a dog outside the bakery. The dog was wagging its tail, chasing a ball, barking with joy. Ethan couldn't help but smile. It reminded him of Ranger's energy when they first came home from overseas. Wild, free, happy to just be alive. That night, as the sun went down, Ethan sat by the porch again. The sound of crickets filled the air. He looked up at the sky and thought about all the places he had seen. Deserts, mountains, cities lit up by distant explosions, and how strange it was that peace had found him here, in a small town with quiet roads and kind strangers. But even with peace, something inside him stirred, a need to keep moving, to keep living with purpose. He had spent so long fighting for survival that stillness felt strange, so he started finding small projects. He began volunteering at the local animal shelter on weekends. At first, he just repaired fences and fixed old kennels, but soon, the workers there noticed how calm animals became around him. They started asking him to help with training. Ethan never mentioned his background, but his quiet authority spoke for itself. The dogs responded to him like they understood his tone without words. It gave him something to look forward to, a sense of purpose again. One afternoon at the shelter, a young dog came in, thin, nervous, and shaking. He had the same brown eyes as Ranger. Ethan knelt down slowly, holding out his hand. The dog sniffed, then pressed his nose against Ethan's palm. "He's scared of men," one of the workers said. "Probably mistreated." Ethan nodded softly. "He'll come around. Just needs time." Over the next few weeks, the dog followed Ethan everywhere at the shelter. He started wagging his tail again, trusting people. Ethan didn't name him. He didn't need to. The dog was a reminder that healing took time, for animals and for people too. One evening, as Ethan was closing up the shelter, the young dog sat beside him, resting his head against his knee. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're a good boy," he said quietly. The moment felt familiar. For the first time in months, his heart felt full again, not because he was replacing what he lost, but because life was finding new ways to fill the emptiness. As summer turned into fall, Ethan's days grew steady again. He spent mornings walking by the creek and evenings fixing small things around the property. The flowers near Ranger's marker grew taller. Birds nested in the nearby trees. The land felt alive. Sometimes townspeople stopped by to visit. They brought homemade pies or asked for help fixing fences. One man even asked Ethan to teach his son some discipline. Not the kind learned from books, but the kind that came from respect, patience, and quiet strength. Ethan agreed. Not because he wanted to be a teacher, but because he saw how the world needed more of that. He taught the boy simple things. How to focus, how to breathe, how to stay calm when things went wrong. The lessons were small but meaningful. And in teaching them, Ethan found that he was learning too. Learning how to live again, how to trust life to keep moving forward. One crisp morning, as he walked down the hill toward town, the sound of church bells echoed through the valley. People were gathering for a small town event, a memorial for local veterans. Ethan hadn't planned on going, but something pulled him toward it. He stood in the back, quiet as always, while the names were read aloud. The crowd was still. The flag fluttered in the breeze. He didn't know most of the people there, but the moment carried a weight he understood. After the ceremony, the mayor walked up to him. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we'd like to honor Ranger too. He served, didn't he?" Ethan paused, then nodded. Yes, he did. A week later, they held a small ceremony near the park. A stone plaque was placed under an old oak tree, engraved with simple words, "Ranger, loyal to the end. May his spirit remind us to serve with courage and heart." The townspeople stood silently as the plaque was revealed. Some clapped softly, others bowed their heads. Ethan didn't speak. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the words, his chest tight but full of pride. After everyone left, he stayed by the plaque for a long time. The sun was low, casting golden light across the grass. He ran his hand over the carved letters and whispered, "We did it, partner. You're not forgotten." The wind rustled through the leaves, almost like an answer. From that day on, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The pain would never fully leave, but it no longer ruled him. He had found a way to turn loss into something meaningful, something that would outlast him. That night he sat on the porch again, the stars shining bright above. The world around him was quiet and calm. He thought about the people who had helped him. The kindness of strangers, the strength of staying patient even when the world seemed unfair. He realized that life wasn't about escaping pain. It was about finding the courage to live through it and keep going anyway. He leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath and looked at the sky. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The night was cool and still. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Ethan closed his eyes, and for a moment he could almost hear Ranger's soft bark echoing through the trees, a reminder that love and loyalty never really fade. He smiled quietly. "Good night, buddy," he said. "Rest easy." And with that, he let the silence settle around him, peaceful, honest, and whole. The seasons changed again, and time moved softly in the little town. The leaves turned gold, then brown, then disappeared under the weight of winter frost. Ethan had grown used to the quiet rhythm of the days. He still woke before dawn, brewed his coffee, and watched the light spread across the fields. Every morning felt calm, steady, and familiar, and that was enough for him. Since the memorial for Ranger, people in town often greeted him differently. Some waved from their cars, others stopped by his porch to say hello. A few of the local kids had even taken to calling him Mr. Cole, asking him questions about the old days or about the dog they'd heard stories of. Ethan never shared details about his time in the military, but he didn't mind talking about Ranger. That was a story he could tell forever. Life had settled into a balance. He volunteered twice a week at the shelter, fixed fences and tools for neighbors, and kept his land neat. The young dog he'd helped train at the shelter, the one who'd once been scared of everything, had been adopted by a family nearby. Ethan visited sometimes, watching from a distance as the dog ran freely across open fields. It made him smile every time. There were moments when the old memories tried to come back. The flashes of noise, the smell of smoke, the echo of orders shouted in the dark. But those moments came softer now, less like attacks, and more like reminders of what he had survived. He had learned not to fight them, only to breathe through them. One cold morning, Ethan received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, stamped from Washington. He set his coffee down and opened it slowly. It was from the Department of Defense, an invitation to a small gathering honoring retired service members who had made significant contributions beyond their duty. His name was on the list. He stared at it for a long while, unsure how to feel. He wasn't the kind of man who cared for ceremonies or attention. But something about this felt different, quieter, more meaningful. Maybe, he thought, it wasn't really about him. Maybe it was about closing a chapter that had been left open for too long. A few weeks later, Ethan drove to the city where the event was held. The hotel lobby was filled with people, veterans, families, young soldiers in crisp uniforms. The sound of laughter and old stories filled the air. For a moment, he felt out of place. Then someone called his name. He turned to see a man with graying hair and a familiar smile. It was an old teammate from his Delta Force days, someone he hadn't seen in almost 20 years. They shook hands firmly, then hugged, both laughing in disbelief. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again," the man said. "Neither did I," Ethan replied. "You're looking good." "Don't lie," his friend joked, patting his stomach. "But I'll take it." They sat together for a while, trading old memories. Not the dark ones, just the stories that still brought light. Times when they'd laughed in impossible places, or found hope when things looked lost. When the ceremony began, Ethan sat quietly in the audience. The speaker talked about courage, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of those who carried the weight of duty long after they left the battlefield. As the words filled the room, Ethan thought about all the people who never made it home, and about Ranger, who had been more than just a dog. When they called his name, he stood and walked to the stage. The applause felt strange to him, warm but distant. The presenter handed him a small plaque, thanking him for his continued service to his community. He nodded, gave a polite smile, and said a few simple words. "I don't think any of us ever stop serving," he said softly. "We just find different ways to do it." The room grew quiet for a moment, and then everyone clapped again. After the event, Ethan stood outside, watching the sunset reflect off the tall buildings. His old friend joined him, still quiet as ever. The man said, "You never change," Ethan chuckled. "Guess some things are better left that way." They talked until the sun disappeared. When it was time to leave, his friend shook his hand one last time. "You ever need anything, brother, you know where to find me." "I know," Ethan said. "And the same goes for you." The drive back home was long but peaceful. He rolled down the window and let the cold air fill the truck.